All right, everyone, welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to do my best to also kind of keep an eye on and let folks in from the waiting room as we go. So sorry if in the first minute or two I am a bit distracted as we get rolling, but I hope you all had a good holiday, enjoyed your time off, albeit a bit quieter than usual. So anyways, we are going to kick things off with our webcast series here in 2021, starting with one of everyone's favorite topics, stream restoration. So for those of you who are just joining, maybe haven't attended one of our webcasts before, or for whom it's been a little while, just a couple of reminders for you all. We will have a couple of quick poll questions at the beginning. You can select your preferred option. For those of you who are maybe back at work, you can fill that out for the way that best represents your group as a whole. We do have questions and comment periods today. I'll probably pause once or twice. If you have them throughout the presentation, feel free to go ahead and pop those into the chat. That'll be the easiest way to handle that. And then at those designated pauses, I will answer as many as I can. We are recording the presentation today, so I will be posting the slides and the recording for the session probably either tomorrow or early next week. I try to get it up as quickly as possible, but you will be able to download those later, either to share or to take another look at if you have to drop off early. And we do have a really short evaluation at the end. I would appreciate it if you guys would take a second to fill that out. It's only 4 multiple choice questions. So it should take less than a minute to fill out, or that's what I'm promised by SurveyMonkey. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off for you all. You don't need to look at me while we're doing the slideshow. So hello, this is what I look like. All right, so we'll go ahead and launch into the poll questions here. I'm going to put all 3 of them up at once on your screen. It's just easier that way in Zoom. So feel free to go ahead and fill out all 3. Basically, the first one we're asking is just who you're representing today. We'd like to get a sense of who we're talking to. So if you are with a local government, the private sector, a regulatory agency, nonprofit, academia, if you're someone else, some of you are state agencies that are not regulatory or otherwise, just go ahead and let us know. The second question is who you are watching with today. Again, helps us get a sense of our numbers. It's a little bit different than usual. I assume most of you are probably either working from home or working by yourself in an office, but we might have a few new coworkers today. Maybe you're indoctrinating your children into the world of stream restoration. You are with your furry coworkers, or some of you may be back in the office as well, hopefully doing so safely. And then the last question is to just give us a sense of what your experience is with stream restoration, so that I kind of know what level you all are coming at it from and what your experience is. We're going to be focusing on protocols 2 and 3, floodplain restoration approaches to stream restoration today. So have you designed or constructed projects for those protocols? Are you a researcher that works on stream restoration? On the planning side, I kind of was thinking about our folks at maybe at the state level or the local level who are working to meet their WIP goals or their TMDLs using stream restoration to do so. Or if you're on the permitting side, or maybe you're just an interested party. If you're something else and you want to tell me about it, you can go ahead and put that in the chat as well. We always like to know who we're talking to. All right, thank you to all of you who have filled that out. I appreciate it. We'll go ahead and close that. I'm still getting some folks trickling in here. All right, so what I'm going to do now, I'll move through these. Before we launch into today's presentation, just a couple of updates and reminders from your friends at CSN. I assume most of you found out about today's webcast through our Stormwater Scoop newsletter, in which case you were probably sick and tired of hearing about the Bubba's contest. But just in case, it's a reminder, we have our Best Urban BMP in the Bay Awards contest going on now. The contest closes on February 5th. It's a really great way to promote the good work that you've done over the last year or two. share some of those lessons learned and successes that you've had, and really kind of get a positive spin on all of our work. We have different categories, whether it's stream restoration was probably most relevant to you all. If you've done a stream restoration project in the last couple of years, we would love to hear about it, and you can submit it through our Bubba's contest. There is a grand prize, $5,000 for the overall winner. We also have a small but mighty award this year as well of $3,000 to try to shine a light on the more shoestring budgeted communities that are doing great work as well. A couple of other new things. We do have a new category among our 7 this year called Innovations in Stormwater Permit Implementation. It's a little bit of a catch-all type of category, but basically if you're doing anything cool that helps with your implementation, whether it is maybe a monitoring program, maybe it's something with your asset management systems, you're doing something that is a little outside the box but doesn't fit neatly into like a stream restoration or a retrofit or something like that. That's a great category. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to shoot me an email and I'd be happy to talk to you about what projects might fit. So again, February 5th is your deadline for that. Also coming soon from CSN, keep an eye out, probably either later this month or early next month. We just wrapped up a new report on the vulnerability analysis and resilient design recommendations for stormwater BMPs. This is the 4th out of 4 reports on climate change and stormwater management. If you are interested in reading the first 3, those are all up on our website already. And again, that 4th one will be coming out very soon. It just went out to our Bay program stakeholders as a draft, and so they'll be taking a look and we'll be finalizing it soon. And then we also are really excited that this year, for those of you who maybe have attended in the past, we usually have our Stormwater Partners Retreat every other year. We used to hold it at the National Conservation Training Center in West Virginia. This year we will be doing the event remotely, but that means that everyone is invited. So we are excited to be doing that. It's going to be a conference style event, but we're going to spread it out over about 3 weeks. So it's a bunch of different interactive webcasts and panels on a range of stormwater topics. We will have a lot more information coming out in the next 2 weeks on that, including save the dates, and then shortly thereafter, ways to register. It'll be a free event, so we hope that you all will join us. All right, so I'm it for you today in terms of speakers. Sorry about that. Hopefully you don't get sick of hearing from me, but what I'm hoping to do today, for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Wood. I'm the Stormwater Coordinator for the Chesapeake Stormwater Network and the coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay Program's Urban Stormwater Work Group. I'm going to be doing an introduction to the work that was recently approved and completed on stream restoration protocols 2 and 3. My hope is that in the next couple of months, we'll have a couple of more either webcasts or resources for you all on the topic so that you can take a deeper dive, bring in maybe some of the panelists that help work on it to walk through some more detailed design examples, talk a little more about the research and things like that. So today is going to be the big overview, kind of give you a sense of what all of the recommendations are, what was covered, and shoot you in the direction of the full report so that you can read about it. But then again, this won't be it. We'll kind of be making the rounds and doing more in this area over the next couple of months this year. So this is what we'll be covering today. Just a brief history. My unabridged history is going to be 1 slide on Chesapeake Bay restoration protocol history. And then a little bit on sort of why we're going back and revisiting the protocols. I'll talk about some of the clarifications that were made and just some more information for those who are less familiar on the different floodplain restoration techniques, and then specifically the changes that have been made to protocols 2 and 3 calculations. And then finally wrapping up with some information about environmental considerations, potential unintended consequences, and best practices for stream restoration that provided its guidance as part of this effort. So we'll get started with the history and revisiting the protocols. For those of you most of you are probably aware, but just in case, the Chesapeake Bay Program's Urban Stormwater Work Group launched an expert panel back in, it probably started in like 2012 and was finally approved in 2013, that laid out how stream restoration practices could be credited for pollutant reductions under the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. After the report was released originally, it was handed over to a group of local governments and practitioners for a test drive period. And some changes were made after that experience to try to, reflect clarifications that were needed and some small improvements that were made after it had been tried out. That also created a bit of a version control issue, though, as we had sort of a test drive version and an original version floating around. Adding to that, the Chesapeake Bay program underwent a revision of its modeling tools in 2017 and 2018. And released a new watershed model that made some changes to how streams and sediment are simulated for TMDL accounting purposes. So we tried in early 2018 to put together a frequently asked questions document. I worked with Bill Stack and Lisa Fraley McNeil at the Center for Watershed Protection to put that together. And all it really did was tell us that there were a lot more questions and probably a need to actually revisit the protocols in their entirety. So in mid-2018, we formed 5 different groups consisting of about 75 different experts to revisit different elements of the protocols. So I've already said the word protocols probably 15 times. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, these were the original 4 from the 2014 report. They reflect the different pollutant removal mechanisms for stream restoration. So prevented sediment, in-stream denitrification, floodplain reconnection, and then dry channel RSCs were pulled out a little bit separately. They were credited as a retrofit practice, but still considered one of the protocols since they're often lumped with stream restoration techniques. As part of this revisitation, one of the other groups was looking at and did add a 5th protocol for prevented sediment, for outfall and gully stabilization practices. It basically is an alternative for protocol 1 if you're working in a really vertically incised system. But we have other webcasts and resources on that. So this is the group that we are going to be talking about today. It was referred to as group 4 in our list of different groups and different protocol numbers. So I'll try to not get you all mixed up with all the different numbering systems we use to keep track of everybody. But we had a really great team of experts that were involved in this effort from the private sector, academia, nonprofits, local governments, all were engaged in revisiting and revising the protocols. There were a couple of guiding principles that were used throughout this process. Part of it, as I mentioned, because there was a revisitation of the Bay Program's modeling tools, they wanted to make sure that all the tweaks were consistent with that tool and was compatible with the model. That's just a necessary evil of kind of working within the Bay Program TMDL framework. It's sort of always one of the principles that we have to follow. The other kind of set of principles were related to making sure that the new guidance was consistent with the original recommendations, but were able to reflect the latest science and experience. Over the last 5 years, there have been hundreds of miles of stream restoration projects that have been implemented, since those first protocols were released in 2014. And there have been a lot of lessons learned that we wanted to make sure were reflected in these new protocols and guidance while staying true to their original intent. All right, so the first thing that I want to get into is, this focus on the different design approaches that are used for floodplain reconnection. So again, we're focusing on projects that are primarily designed for protocols 2 and 3. However, of course, a lot of these projects are kind of ticking all of the boxes, including protocol 1. While the protocols are generally agnostic, they did not want to really throw any shade on any particular design approaches. The experts felt that it was really important to add some clarity as to sort of the common principles, the terminology, as well as adding some figures and things like that to make sure that folks were on the same page when you're talking about legacy sediment removal or regenerative stormwater conveyance systems or stream conveyance systems. They focused on sort of two different approaches, the first of which is floodplain restoration using legacy sediment removal. Basically, this is the idea where you're removing legacy sediments from the floodplain in order to reduce bank heights, expand hyporheic exchange. Your goal really primarily is to reconnect the floodplain with the coarse gravel hyporheic aquifer that underlies the floodplain. There are a couple of key terminologies that are involved here. There are also some qualifying conditions that are laid out by the group, like confirming that you have those legacy sediments present within the floodplain, and some information about how that can be done. Soil stratigraphy, LIDAR, even using historical analysis and documentation can help you do that. Also making sure that they were consistent about how you demonstrate that reconnection with the hyporheic aquifer. And a lot of this is based on going out to the site and doing some sampling and doing some confirmation that you were achieving the goals that you're set out to achieve. Those principles are similar for the other primary technique, which is floodplain restoration involving raising the stream bed. This approach essentially accomplishes a lot of the same goals. The objectives are the same in a lot of ways, but you're raising the surface water level, generally either by filling the incised channel with native materials in order to elevate that invert and get the water out onto the floodplain more often, or you're installing riffle grade control structures or beaver dam analogs or something like that in order to slow down the flow velocity and promote more floodplain access during storm events. So again, the goals are to lower those bank heights, get more connection between shallow groundwater and surface water in the floodplain, and get more interaction with that root zone. In both cases, you have some sort of overall qualifying criteria. Basically, the group recommended that in order to be eligible for pollutant removal credit under the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, you have to, first of all, meet the qualifying conditions that were originally outlined by the expert panel in 2014. They felt that those conditions still held up well and should remain in place. They added a couple that applied regardless of the design approach. Basically, mostly common sense things, but things that, they wanted to make sure were codified in these recommendations. And that was, making sure that the project meets the applicable floodplain management requirements for the stream corridor, making sure that you're not putting, structures and other infrastructure at risk due to the increased access of the surface water to the floodplain. Also making sure that the duration of ponding in the floodplain is consistent with the restoration goals. There are certainly values to micropools for amphibian habitat and things like that, and those are called out. But you also, they wanted to make sure that we were avoiding the circumstance of creating a wet pond in the floodplain where you have this long-term inundation of large volumes of water in the floodplain that could potentially do damage to riparian vegetation communities and things like that. And sort of along those lines, just demonstrating consideration to potential unintended consequences. So looking at making sure you're identifying the impairment affecting the stream reach that you want to restore, looking to show that you're achieving some degree of functional uplift with your design and with that project, and also minimizing the unintended consequences and being very clear about what those restoration objectives are at the outset. All right, so now kind of getting the initial stuff out of the way as far as the design approaches and the qualifying criteria. I'm going to go ahead and dive into the recommendations for each of the protocols. This is what the general sort of simplified calculation looks like now for protocol 2. So in order to get the load reduction for Protocol 2, which is just a nitrogen credit, you have to define what the group called the EHZ, or the expanded hypereic zone. Then you multiply that area by your denitrification rate and then adjust it by some site-specific factors to account for conditions that promote those denitrification conditions. So this is a change from the way that the original expert panel had defined Protocol 2. There were not those site-specific adjustment factors. And then we're going to talk again about this hypereic zone. So the original expert panel had, you might remember, the hypereic box. It was a three-dimensional construct that extended 5 feet below the invert of the stream channel and then 5 feet on either side of the banks, at least as a default. The panel sort of clarified that you should be doing some level of testing to confirm that there wasn't a constraining layer that prevented, that maybe cut off your box at only 2 feet of depth or something like that, like a bedrock layer or something. But based on, experience, a lot of times that was not being conducted in the field. It was also a challenge in terms of the use of defaults for things like bulk density measurements in that hypereic box that were part of the equation as well. A lot of times folks were relying on defaults for those numbers. So anyways, the experts felt that it made a lot more sense, and based on the available literature for denitrification as well, to shift the units to this areal-based approach. So replacing the hypereic box with this area called the effective hypereic zone that essentially extends across the floodplain, most likely further laterally than maybe the original box concept did, but only to areas where the floodplain surface is 18 inches or less above the low flow groundwater elevation. The reason for that being the interactivity of the floodplain root zone that creates a really important carbon source in the floodplain that promotes denitrification. So this is something that can be done in a lot of ways. You can sort of do an estimate probably from a desktop level, but again, you're going to be going out to the site to confirm the dimensions of that zone with things like some level of soil stratigraphy or looking at carbon sources within the soils or soil saturation levels and things like that to confirm that you have those dimensions correct. The next update goes to that unit denitrification rate. So part of this was necessitated by the change to an area-based rate. So the original denitrification rate was based on that volume measurement. It was a pounds per ton measurement. So now the group went back and they did a really comprehensive literature review to make sure that the new rate reflected the latest literature on denitrification. And so what they ended up deciding on after they did a really deep dive into it was to take the difference in the median nitrate uptake rates between restored and unrestored streams based on a study done by Newcomer Johnson et al. In 2016. And then they adjusted that to by about 30% to show how much of that uptake was from denitrification. And so that was based on a study by Mulholland et al. And so they really felt that after the review of the literature, this worked in a couple of ways. It was an area-based rate. It focused on denitrification, and it was reflective of restoration sites all across the watershed, quite a number of restoration projects, whereas the original denitrification rate was largely based on a handful of measurements in Baltimore County, Maryland. So this really expands the scientific basis behind these rates. The other thing that they really wanted to do was then apply these site-specific discount factors to that rate, which sort of represented what they felt was sort of best case conditions. So they came up with this adjustment equation that was developed largely by Art Parola from the University of Louisville, who was a member of this expert group in consultation with the other experts on the group, where basically you take this base rate and then you multiply it by these 3 different adjustment factors. So you have your base flow reduction factor, your floodplain height factor, and an aquifer conductivity factor. Each of these takes into consideration different elements that would affect the denitrification rate. So with aquifer conductivity, for instance, you're looking at coarser grain materials that allow more water to interact between the surface and the floodplain. So the more water that is moving through that root zone, the more opportunity that there is for denitrification to occur, as opposed to being sort of restricted with those finer grain materials, clays and things like that, that might prevent water movement through that floodplain hypereik zone. The floodplain height factor accounts for sort of sustained saturation in that zone, providing ample opportunity for that denitrification to occur, and sort of the same with the base flow reduction factors. If you're getting base flow in that hypereik zone throughout the year, you are increasing the opportunity for that denitrification. So that's how these factors were derived. A couple of other notes on changes for Protocol 2. They also decided to eliminate the bank height ratio requirement. Most of these floodplain restoration approaches are low bank projects. Sort of the whole purpose of their design is to increase interaction between the surface water and the floodplain. And so they felt that it was a bit of a redundant requirement. They also wanted to emphasize that in this case, as well as any of the BMP protocols for that matter, the final reductions should reflect the difference between pre and post restoration conditions. Especially with these floodplain restoration techniques, it's important to kind of have an understanding of where there is already some level of hypereik exchange happening in a site prior to restoration. In most cases, these sites that are being chosen for restoration are, of course, the most degraded. They're heavily incised. There probably is not a lot of connection. So this might be, sort of moot, but you still kind of have to go through the process of investigating and demonstrating that this is an improvement over existing conditions, and only taking the pollutant removal credit for that improvement. All right, going on to Protocol 3, and just a reminder for folks, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. It's a lot of content, a lot of material to cover, so feel free to go ahead and put those in as we go through. Protocol 3, the general equation or the general process here is sort of similar in that we have a defined project area and elevation. You contribute or you calculate how much of the flow or loads are being diverted out into the floodplain. So you have to know what is coming to the reach and then how much of that is getting out onto the floodplain. And then you have to figure out what percentage of that flow that gets out onto the floodplain is actually being treated or removed. So that's the basic idea behind the protocol. This is, again, consistent with the original recommendations from the expert panel. So the big changes here was a change in how that flow diversion component of the equation is done. Originally, the expert panel used what we were calling an upstream approach, which used basically rainfall runoff models to figure out how much of the annual stream flow was being diverted into the floodplain. The concern from the experts and the practitioners is that a lot of times those rainfall runoff models are not capturing some of the flow that's generated from smaller storm events. And in some of these really low bank projects, there is a lot of water that is getting out on the floodplains that was not being captured using those approaches. So the recommendation and the decision from the experts was to replace that upstream approach with a downstream method, which essentially uses these scaled representative USGS gauge stations in order to calculate overbank flow. So essentially you kind of look at this USGS stream flow data from watersheds with very similar characteristics and use that to figure out how much of your annual flow is sort of falling in this treatment area, which is sort of above what can be contained by the channel, and below sort of this 1 foot depth that is sort of a default cutoff rate, where you're thinking maybe if the water, the flow is over a foot, it may be bypassing floodplain treatment. That can be relaxed per their recommendations if you have some data to demonstrate lower flow conditions that might provide time and opportunity for some of those nutrients and sediments to settle out in the floodplain, but we'll talk about that in a second. So basically the idea, there are a couple of different, before I move on, a couple of different ways that this can be done. Those methods are outlined in the report. There is not really a standard in terms of there is one way that this can be done, but there are some key principles to keep in mind in terms of the types of flow data that you're using. But there are some hydrograph separation types of techniques that can be used. The Bay program is going to look into funding to provide some tools that will make this process more streamlined for you, in terms of developing a series of regional flow curves that can be based on those regional differences with those similar watershed characteristics. So it's easier to just kind of pull the one that is most appropriate for you, as well as an accompanying series of spreadsheet tools so that you can put in your project conditions and it will spit out these numbers for you. We didn't have the funding to do that as part of this initial effort. So we laid out the principles for the approach, but there is still a little bit of latitude as long as you're following the principles to kind of develop or tweak the methods as needed, at this point in time. So again, there's going to be more hopefully coming on this to make this process a little bit easier. I do expect that there will be more questions on this sort of as folks begin to work with it and apply it. But hopefully this is a much more defensible method for how this diversion approach is calculated. The other big change with Protocol 3 was an update to the floodplain treatment efficiencies. So the original expert panel relied on wetland pollutant removal rates from an older wetland expert panel report from, I believe it was 2006 or 2007. Since then, the Bay Program's wetland work group convened and completed 2 expert panels on non-tidal wetland efficiencies. And so their comprehensive literature review involved, hundreds of studies, including floodplain wetlands. And so these experts chose to, again, remain consistent with the concepts of the original panel and just essentially updated these efficiencies with these new rates based on this more recent literature review. There are different types of wetland BMPs that were created by that expert panel. And so basically the guidance is that when selecting the rate that is most appropriate for your Protocol 3 project, you choose the one that reflects the predominant wetland type at the site. The definitions are all in the report, so I would encourage you to take a look at that to figure out what is appropriate. The other thing that's kind of important to understand is that you cannot sort of double report these wetland practices. So if you end up with a floodplain wetland and you are going to report it in your Protocol 3 floodplain trapping zone, so sort of the extent of your floodplain reconnection, you couldn't also report it as a non-tidal wetland BMP to the Bay program because you would essentially be claiming that credit twice. You can implement these projects independent of a stream restoration project and claim the credit as a BMP. But it is important just to know that there are some distinctions there and they can't be reported twice. And then finally, I'm not going to go into all the details here. I think we are going to be working with the CAST team at the Bay program to do a webinar sometime later this spring, a little bit more specific to how to do this in CAST. But you also have to figure out how much loading you have that's reaching your restoration site, because you have to have a number that you're applying that efficiency to, right? You need to know how many pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment you're reducing by 42%, for instance. And so there is a process outlined in an appendix that goes step by step with screenshots and visuals for how you use CAST to get that delivered load. CAST will give you what that upstream load is that's being delivered to your project reach. So you can put in your location and a few other details there, and it will spit out a spreadsheet for you that tells you the pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that are being delivered to your site for restoration. All right, and just to wrap this part up, there are a couple of other recommendations around Protocol 3. There is no longer an upstream watershed to floodplain surface area ratio reduction. It's a bit in the weeds, but for those of you who do the protocols, it was just another thing that you had to keep in mind. That is no longer part of the recommendations. Again, the note about these should reflect the difference between pre and post restoration conditions is particularly important when you're thinking about the wetland conditions on the site, when you're choosing your efficiency. So if there were existing wetlands, that's going to affect what your overall load reductions are. Similarly, presumably even in some incised streams, there's some amount of flow that is getting out onto the floodplains during larger storm events. So that needs to be accounted for as well. I mentioned the 1 foot cap on floodplain flow. There are circumstances where that can be relaxed. There is some data that was provided to the group on sort of lower flow conditions, allowing more of those particulates to be settled out into the floodplain. The exception to that is that Maryland has asked for sort of a special exception. This is documented in, I forget the appendix number, but it's the last appendix in the report. They are reserving the right to kind of make some adjustments to that. They didn't feel comfortable with relaxing the 1 foot cap at this time and are planning to do some of their own investigation on that. So if you're in Maryland, just keep that in mind. And then I also mentioned we're working on some more tools for standardizing that Protocol 3 application. So as we get that information and as those are developed, we will continue to let you know. All right, before I dive into the environmental considerations, I'll take a quick pause and see if there are questions from folks on the protocols. One of the questions for Protocol 2, if the stream channel bottom is more than 18 inches vertically from the floodplain, can you still claim Protocol 2 credit for the areas within the channel? Yes, I think you could. There is some ambiguity there because the idea is really to promote exchange with the floodplain. I think you probably could. It would be a pretty limited amount of credit, assuming that the width of your channel is not particularly wide. So it's sort of is the juice worth the squeeze? But I would assume that there is going to be some level or some degree of exchange between your surface water and your higher groundwater beneath the channel. And that is consistent with the original expert panel recommendations and the hyperrake box concept. So yes, you can claim that area as part of Protocol 2. And then another question from Jason about the implementation of the protocols by the summertime. As far as a timeline for the documents and tools accompanying Protocol 3. There is not at this time a timeline for that because we have to get the funding to do it. So our hope in terms of sort of the quickest timeline, there is a pot of money that is available annually through the Bay program to different work groups, and we can submit a funding request to do that work, which is one of the options that we're going to consider this year. but that would probably mean that a tool wouldn't be available until summer of 2022. We can continue to look into other options. If folks have other funding sources available to help with that, please reach out and let me know. But that's probably a pretty good estimate at this point in time. But like I said, there are some resources that are provided in the report to help with that. There was some work done by Barbara Dahl in North Carolina that has some information on an approach that they use down there that is appropriate. And there's some other tools that we can help connect you with, some resources we can help you connect with in the meantime, if you were starting to work on this before those tools are available, because they can be done. It's just hopefully going to simplify and provide a little bit more consistency in the way that folks are applying it. All right, without any more in the chat box right now, I'll go ahead and move on. This is the last section for today, which is the environmental considerations that were mentioned in the report. Environmental considerations, it is probably the touchiest subject when it comes to stream restoration. The way that this is handled, just for some background on it, potential for unintended consequences is a section that is required to be addressed for really any BMP in the Bay watershed when there's a panel report or a document like this. It is written into the guidance that be addressed in order to get approval by the Bay program partners. So it was already in the charge in that sense. However, the primary purpose of those documents are mostly on documenting the crediting mechanisms for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, as well as the qualifying conditions. So these recommendations and environmental considerations, I think, are really important and shouldn't be overlooked in any sense. However, they are advisory in nature, and really the goal is to promote best practices and get folks on the same page. So the group wanted to lay out all of the available research on the potential unintended consequences from stream restoration. And so they did that, and then they went a step further to outline a series of best practices to try to avoid those unintended consequences in the 3 different stages of project completion. So from siting and design, and then construction, and then post-construction. So I'll warn you that this is going to be sort of the driest section of the presentation, in the sense that it is mostly bulleted lists here that I'm going to present on some of those best practices with fewer graphics and photos, but bear with me because I do think it is important to talk about, because we do have literature available, albeit somewhat limited, but there's also quite a bit of just anecdotal experience from the completion of projects over the last several years, where stream restorations can result in things like loss of tree canopy or riparian forest communities, iron flocculation, extended ponding within the floodplain that can cause impacts on riparian vegetation communities, failures from projects due to extreme storm events and things like that always have the potential to result in damages to downstream infrastructure or floodplains as well. So these are all things that need to be taken into consideration during all phases of the project. That said, all of the impacts are related to a lot of factors that can vary across sites and across projects. So a lot of times these unintended consequences are the result of things like inadequate project assessment. It can be site-specific factors, regarding existing soil conditions, different grade controls that are in place, extreme flow and storm events, as we see higher and higher intensity events with climate change, that is increasingly an issue if projects are undersized or use an inappropriate reference condition for design. So, care needs to be taken when selecting the project location, design, construction techniques, as well as other alternatives, to stream restoration to try to minimize these impacts. A couple of notes that the group wanted to make sure were mentioned is that, you know, a lot of these impacts need to be considered in relation to the unrestored condition. You know, it's, again, seems sort of obvious, but a lot of these systems are heavily degraded. And so, you know, that has to be part of the consideration as well, as does sort of other interventions that could be done in the upland areas, either before or in combination with stream restoration, to make sure that the impairments that are affecting those stream corridors are being addressed, to make sure that they're more successful in the long run. There's also sort of a lack of data or information with these longer term longitudinal studies of stream restoration. Some of the ones that we have, for instance, at the Big Spring Run site in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, have indicated that in some cases the adverse impacts might be short term, although they are common, but there is an adjustment period after which there might be some recovery over several years as the construction impacts fade, as riparian plant communities reestablish, and things like that. And so one of the recommendations is really just an increased need for research at these cross-disciplinary long-term studies that can take a look at these different factors, how they might change over time, so that we can start to chip away and get a really firm grasp as to what the best practices are for avoiding them, and making sure that we're really doing the best that we can to improve the functions and ultimately the ecological conditions in these systems. So I mentioned upland alternatives to stream restoration. It comes up a lot. It is in the qualifying criteria actually for the BMP, so it's more than sort of just a best practice, but just to make sure that these projects are part of a comprehensive watershed-based approach to restoration. A lot of times that means looking at what options you have in the upland, especially in highly urbanized areas where these really flashy systems or high flow events are going to always create a problem in these stream systems. It's going to impact what your restoration objectives and goals are, but also should be part of the consideration. You know, are there opportunities to implement retrofits in combination with these projects? We have some good examples, including past Bubba's winners, where this has been done with quite a bit of success. It's not a silver bullet, but it is something to always make sure you're keeping in mind, that just a single stream restoration is not going to be as sustainable if it is not considered as part of a comprehensive restoration strategy. In terms of project assessment and design, this is sort of getting into the specific best practices that the group recommended. So I mentioned evaluating other options, identifying impairments, also conducting habitat function assessments prior to design, making sure that you're identifying where you already have quality stream and wetland resources present, so that you can preserve what you can, or at least make sure that you are doing the best you can to improve upon the existing conditions, even if your objectives call for a shift in what that habitat community might look like. Make sure that those are fully considered in the design site selection phase. There was also an emphasis through collaboration with some other partners and other work groups and goal teams that focus on fisheries systems, on thinking about protections for things like freshwater mussels, their host fish and their habitat needs. Along those lines, for projects that involve in-stream structures, it's very important to consider aquatic life passage issues, especially in more vertical systems and things like that, where check dams and things like that can potentially obstruct passage. So making sure that those are considered. I mentioned it in the qualifying conditions, but these stagnant pools within the stream channels, as well as on the floodplain, need to be considered. If you have not watched our webcast on Protocol 1 for prevented sediment, or read the report on the new recommendations for Protocol 1, I recommend that you do that. That talks a lot about the issue of excessive bank armoring, using softer approaches to reduce bank erosion in these systems, while also maintaining or enhancing habitat value. And then the others are sort of self-explanatory, making sure you're avoiding significant expansion of the floodplain, or at least documenting and defining what that is going to be, to make sure that you're working with the appropriate authorities within your state or community, to make sure you're covering all your bases there. During the construction phase, there has been some evidence that iron-rich in-stream construction materials can leach, causing flocculation over time. So that's something to be aware of. There are some new resources and research in that area that were addressed and laid out by the panel. Similarly, with the addition of organic matter in the stream bed, that can sometimes cause leaching concerns as well. At the same time, protecting mature trees that are existing in the floodplain to the extent possible is considered a best practice, minimizing compaction, working in the dry, but also recycling any trees that do have to be removed within the site is also recommended. And then in the post-construction, a plug for another of the 4 reports. I think I've mentioned them all now at this point. The first group looked at verification for stream restoration practices. So some simple visual indicators that you can use to determine if the project is still meeting the pollutant removal functions that it was designed for. So you can do that by just sort of doing a stream walk, flagging some of those indicators, and then if warranted, going back and doing a deeper investigation into the cause. We call them those forensic BMP investigations to figure out what you can do to address those issues. We also recommend kind of making sure that you're focusing on things like bank heights and desired floodplain plant community targets, as those are really essential for the definitions of both Protocol 2 and Protocol 3, as well as the removal efficiencies associated with them. Part of that, of course, is also invasive species management, and making sure that there isn't accidental dewatering of the stream system and things like that, or potential obstructions that might cause pooling or inundation at inopportune times or in inopportune places. So that sort of wraps up that section as well. This is my last slide. I just want to mention that in terms of continuing to move the ball forward, the group also recommended a series of future research priorities. These are part of, again, every panel and expert group report. These, I mentioned some of them, the importance of long-term interdisciplinary research studies that not just look at the nutrient and sediment dynamics, but also how these projects are related to and interacting with functional improvements for the stream biology, as well as habitat features and things like that, and how do those change over time. Short-term research is also needed, and in a lot of cases I understand more feasible. And so, best practices for mitigating those unintended environmental impacts was raised, because a lot of what we have at this point are sort of anecdotal and based on, post-construction monitoring and things like that as required by the permits to identify some of these concerns. And so being able to document that in a peer-reviewed sort of way can go a long way. And I mentioned the functional uplift and loss. We still don't have a great way of defining and testing metrics for how we measure those functional changes. There are more and more, things in the work now to move towards that goal, but especially in urban systems where we have so many constraints already with the ability to provide uplift, especially in those higher levels of the functional pyramid. How are we defining success? How are we measuring success in terms of those improvements over time with these restoration projects? So all of that is still needed. So, you know, I would not be shocked, as much as I would love to be done with stream restoration for a very long time after the last 2 years of work on this. I'm sure that there will be another revisitation in the next 5 to 8 years as we continue to grow and learn more in the field. So that is all I have. It is about 5 minutes to 1. We have some time for comments and questions if folks have them. You can go ahead and put those in the chat, and I will try to get to as many as I can over the next couple of minutes. So thanks all for bearing with me. Hopefully it wasn't too much information. It was easy to follow. I will also put the evaluation in the chat box. If you give me one moment, I'm going to type that in so you can link directly to it. It'll only take a couple of seconds to fill that out for us, but we really appreciate you taking the opportunity to let us know how we're doing. It also goes a long way for our funders to understand that we're providing useful resources for you all. I'll also, one other note before I get into the questions, I will put not just the recording and the slides from today up on our website. I will also, on today's event page, link to the report. I assume most of you have maybe found it already, but if not, I'll put it there as well as on our stream restoration page so that you can find it all in one place. All right. Question from Jason: when selecting cross sections for both protocols 2 and protocol 3, do you have any guidance on where to select cross sections or determine representative cross sections? Is there any requirement or guidance on the number that need to be taken? Especially curious when it comes to the existing conditions, since channel and floodplains can differ so much. That's a good question. The group did talk about that a little bit. They did not put together any particularly strong recommended guidance in terms of cross sections. I think generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is to follow the guidance that was provided by the prevented sediment group. It was particularly applicable there because you have to take soil and nutrient concentrations and bulk density measurements, but sort of roughly every 400 to 500 feet across, the length or down the length of a project will help give you a pretty decent representative sampling of your conditions. But there's a lot of best professional judgment involved in that as well when you go out to do your site assessments. So while that's a decent rule of thumb, it's going to vary sort of up and down, and there might be certain areas that you want to target if you have sort of maybe an existing wetland delineation for the site or something like that you want to use to guide some of your assessments. So you're going to want a couple of cross sections just to make sure it's representative, but it's going to vary site to site. All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat, nor do I see anybody typing. Anything else from folks before we wrap up? We are impressively right on time as my clock just ticked over to 1 o'clock. So I'll just say thank you all again for joining today. I really appreciate it. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out via email. Again, I'll get everything posted for you all, the recording and the slides, either tomorrow or Monday morning. So you can go back and check that out and share that with folks. Thanks again. Fill out the survey, send in your Bubba's contest submissions, and we will have more details on the rest of our webcast series and the Runoff Rendezvous in your inboxes in the next 2 weeks. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.